The sun hung high over the village, its golden rays casting long shadows on the dusty ground. The air shimmered with heat, and the scent of roasting yams drifted from nearby huts. In the heart of the village there stood a grand house, larger than any other, with tall wooden pillars and a roof made of strong thatch. It belonged to the wealthiest family in the village, a family that had more land, more cattle, and more food than anyone else, and within this house, working from dawn until night, was a boy named Kwame. Kwame had no family of his own. He had been brought to the household as a young child, taken in not out of kindness but out of necessity. He was an orphan, left alone after sickness took his parents. The village elders had placed him in the care of the wealthy household, believing that with all their riches they would provide for him, but instead of finding love and care, Kwame found labor and mockery. The family members rarely spoke to him with kindness. The children of the house, Kojo and Ebony, often teased him. They were well fed and well dressed, their skin glowing from the oils and butters their mother applied each morning. Compared to them, Kwame's skin was darker, deep as the rich soil after a fresh rain, and because of this they made him the subject of their cruel jokes. "Kwame, where did you go?" Kojo would say with a smirk whenever they sat outside at night. "I can't see you any more. Have you vanished into the darkness?" Ebony would giggle, adding, "Maybe if you washed harder you'd be lighter like us." Their words stung, but Kwame never responded. He kept his head down and focused on his work. He fetched water from the well each morning, carried heavy baskets of maize from the fields, scrubbed the floors until they shone, and tended to the goats and chickens. No task was too small or too great for him. Though his hands were rough and his feet bore calluses from walking barefoot on hot earth, he never complained. The mother of the house, Nania, was a proud woman. She dressed in bright, elegant fabrics, and always carried herself with grace, but to Kwame her words were sharp as the blade of a knife. "Work faster, boy," she would say whenever she passed him. "Lazy hands make an empty stomach." Kwame never spoke back. He only nodded and did as he was told. He knew his place in the household, and he accepted it even when his heart ached from loneliness. The father, Kwasi, was a man of power. He was respected in the village for his wealth and wisdom, but he never truly saw Kwame as anything more than a servant. When he did acknowledge the boy, it was often with a jest. "Kwame, you are as dark as the bottom of my cooking pot," he would laugh, patting his belly after a hearty meal. The other villagers knew of the family's treatment of Kwame, but no one intervened. They shook their heads in pity, but believed that fate had already decided his role in life. After all, some were born to be served while others were born to serve. Yet despite everything, Kwame remained kind. He never let their words poison his heart. He found solace in the little moments. When the morning sun warmed his skin, when the wind whispered secrets through the trees, or when he watched the birds soar freely above, he dreamed of a life beyond servitude, a life where he could be seen not for his skin but for his heart. One evening, after finishing his task, Kwame sat alone under the baobab tree outside the house. He traced patterns in the dirt with his finger, lost in thought. The stars began to appear, twinkling like scattered diamonds across the sky. It was the only time of day when he felt truly at peace. As he gazed at the heavens, he whispered to himself, "One day I will be more than this. One day I will show them that my worth is not in my skin but in my deeds." Little did he know fate was already weaving the threads of his destiny, preparing him for the storm that would change everything. The sky darkened over the village, heavy clouds rolling in from the horizon like a great beast waking from slumber. The air grew thick with the scent of rain, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed across the land. The villagers hurried about, closing windows, tying down baskets, and calling their children indoors, but in the grand house of the wealthy family no one paid attention to the coming storm. Inside the house, Nanaya sat on a wooden stool, weaving a new cloth for the market, her hands moving skillfully through the fabric. Kojo and Ebony played by the doorway, laughing as they tossed small pebbles at each other. Their father, Kwasi, sat outside watching the cattle graze, unaware of the fate about to befall them. Kwame had just finished sweeping the floor when the wind howled through the open window, scattering dust and loose leaves into the air. He rushed to close the shutters, but the force of the wind made it difficult. His small hands trembled as he pushed against the wooden frame, but he did not stop. He had learned long ago that if he failed in his tasks there would be consequences. As the first raindrops splattered against the roof, Kwasi finally took notice of the storm. He stood stretching his back and called to his wife, "Nanaya, bring in the baskets before the rain ruins our food." But before she could answer, a loud crack split the air. The mighty baobab tree that had stood outside their home for generations had been struck by lightning. A massive branch came crashing down, smashing the fence and sending the cattle scattering into the wild panic erupted. Nana screamed, Kojo and Ebony ran for cover. Kwasi grabbed a spear and rushed outside, but the rain fell so hard that he could barely see the cattle. Their most valuable possessions were fleeing into the darkness. Kwasi bellowed, his voice desperate and angry. Go after the cattle. If we lose them, we will have nothing left. Kwame hesitated for only a moment. He had never been allowed to touch the cattle before, only to clean their pens and feed them, but now in their time of crisis they looked to him to save what they cherished the most. Without a word he ran into the storm, his bare feet splashing through the mud, his heart pounding against his ribs. The rain stung his skin, the wind roared in his ears, but he pushed forward. He could see the cattle in the distance, their white bodies barely visible through the heavy rain. He chased after them, calling out in a voice he did not know he had. He jumped over fallen branches, ducked beneath low-hanging trees, and ignored the pain in his legs. Every step forward was a battle, but he did not stop. For hours he fought against the storm, the wind lashing at him, the mud clinging to his feet. Finally he reached the herd. Using the tricks he had observed from the older herders, he guided the frightened animals back toward the house. Slowly, carefully, he led them through the storm, one step at a time. By the time he returned, soaked and shivering, the storm had begun to ease. The family stood at the doorway, eyes wide with shock. Kwame had done what none of them could. He had saved their most prized possessions. He stood panting, his chest rising and falling as rain dripped from his hair. For the first time Nana did not have a sharp word for him. Kojo and Ebony did not laugh at him. Kwasi looked at the boy with something new in his eyes, something Kwame had never seen before. Respect. Yet despite what he had done, despite the struggle he had endured, he knew deep down that this moment would not change everything. The storm had passed, but the true challenge still lay ahead. The sky turned an angry shade of gray, thick clouds swallowing the sun as the first heavy raindrops splattered against the dry earth. The wind howled like an unseen beast, rattling the wooden shutters and bending the trees until they groaned under the pressure. The village had never seen a storm like this before. Inside the grand house, the wealthy family huddled together, their faces pale with worry. Nana clutched her fine cloth to her chest, staring out the window as the rain poured in through the cracks. Kojo and Ebony whimpered, holding on to their mother. As the wind howled through the house, Kwasi stood by the doorway, gripping his walking stick, his jaw clenched as he listened to the chaos outside. Their food baskets lay outside unprotected, the storm already soaking through the grains and yams. Their cattle had broken through the fence, fleeing into the wilderness. The fire in their cooking area had been drowned by the relentless downpour, leaving them cold and helpless. Kwame saw their distress, he saw the fear in their eyes, the trembling in their hands. Despite the cruel words they had spoken to him, despite the way they had treated him as nothing more than a servant, his heart did not harden against them. Instead, he stepped forward with quiet determination. He could not stand by and watch them suffer. He would help them, even if they never saw his worth. Without a word, he pushed open the heavy wooden door and ran into the storm. The wind lashed against his face, rain drenching his thin clothes as he sprinted through the village. His feet slipped in the mud, but he did not slow down. He knew that without food and warmth the family would not last the night. First, he made his way to the trees on the edge of the village. These were the tallest trees, their branches heavy with ripe fruit. The wind made them sway dangerously, but Kwame did not hesitate. He climbed, gripping the wet bark with strong hands, pulling himself higher and higher. The rain blurred his vision, but he reached the top, carefully plucking the ripest fruits and stuffing them into his cloth sack. Just as he began his descent, a gust of wind nearly knocked him loose, but he held on, his heart pounding as he slowly made his way down. With the fruits secured, he turned to the swollen river. The once calm waters had transformed into a raging torrent, but Kwame knew that beneath the surface fish still swam. He fashioned a makeshift net from fallen branches and vines, throwing it into the water. He waited, his muscles tensed against the cold. Finally, he pulled it back, revealing several wriggling fish. He quickly secured them in his sack before running back toward the house. But his work was not yet done. The cattle had scattered into the darkness, and without them the family would lose their wealth, their food, and their status. With his breath heavy and his body aching, Kwame set off into the wilderness. His bare feet left prints in the mud, his ears straining to hear the familiar sounds of hooves against wet earth. He tracked them through the storm, following their prints in the softened ground. He called out to them using the gentle voice he had heard the village herders use before. Slowly he guided them back one by one. Despite the thunder that rolled across the sky, the last cow resisted, frightened by the storm, but Kwame did not give up. He moved carefully, speaking in low, soothing tones until the animal finally followed him home. By the time he returned to the house, his sack filled with food and the cattle safely behind him, he was exhausted, his body was trembling, his hands scratched from climbing the trees, his legs covered in mud and cuts, but he had done it, he had saved them. The family stood in the doorway, their eyes wide with disbelief. Nana clutched her chest, staring at the food. Kojo and Ebony looked at the cattle, then at Kwame, their mouths slightly open. Kwasi stepped forward, his eyes filled with something new, something unfamiliar. Gratitude. Kwame said nothing, he simply set the food down and turned away, walking toward his small corner of the house. The storm had passed, but he knew that his place in the family had not changed. Even after everything he had done, they would still see him as the servant, the orphan, the boy with dark skin. But deep inside he knew the truth, he was more than that, he was strong, he was capable, he was worthy. And one day they would see it too. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world washed clean by the rain. The once dusty earth was now thick with mud, and the scent of wet soil filled the air. The wind had quieted to a gentle whisper, rustling the leaves that clung stubbornly to the trees. The dark clouds that had loomed over the village like an angry spirit were now drifting away, revealing a sky speckled with stars. Inside the grand house, the wealthy family stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the boy they had once ridiculed. Kwame, drenched in rain and covered in mud, stood before them, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. His thin arms bore scratches from climbing trees, his feet were stained from the earth, and his hands trembled slightly from the cold. Yet despite his weary body, his eyes burned with determination. Scattered before him lay the fruits he had gathered, the fish he had caught, and the cattle he had risked his life to retrieve. The fire he had built crackled softly, its warm glow pushing back the lingering chill of the storm. The family watched in amazement. They had spent years looking down on Kwame, treating him as if he were less than them. They had mocked his dark skin, belittled his presence, and given him the heaviest burdens without a second thought. And yet in their time of need, when the storm had stripped them of their comforts, it was Kwame who had saved them. Kojo and Ebony, who had always teased him, lowered their heads, their cheeks burning with shame. They remembered the cruel jokes they had made, the times they had laughed at him simply because he was different from them, and yet Kwame had not hesitated to help them. Nania, the proud and elegant mother of the house, stepped forward. She had always believed herself to be wise, always prided herself on her status in the village, but now standing before this boy who had risked everything for them, she felt humbled. She reached out and took Kwame's hands in her own. His hands were rough, calloused from years of labor, but she held them gently, as if realizing for the first time the weight he had carried for them. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, truly looked at him, not as a servant but as something far greater. Kwame, she whispered, her voice trembling, you are not just strong, but your heart is pure like gold. Kwame blinked in surprise. Never before had she spoken to him with such tenderness. He had long accepted that kindness from this family was something he would never receive, but here she was holding his hands, her eyes filled with something he had never seen before, respect. Kwasi, the father, the man who had often jested about Kwame's dark skin, stepped forward next. His usual proud stance was gone, replaced by something softer, something uncertain. He had always believed himself to be a man of wisdom, a leader among his people, and yet tonight he realized how blind he had been. We were blind, he admitted, his voice low but filled with sincerity. We saw only your skin and not your kindness. For a long moment there was silence. The fire crackled, the wind hummed softly through the gaps in the walls, and the distant chirping of crickets filled the air. Kwame stood there, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. For years he had longed for these words. He had dreamt of a day when they would see him not as a servant, not as an outsider, but as someone worthy of their respect. And now that day had come. Kojo, the boy who had often mocked him, took a hesitant step forward. Kwame, he said, his voice small, I am sorry for the things I said. Ebony nodded beside him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. We were wrong, she murmured, we were so wrong. Kwame looked at them, his heart heavy with emotions he could not name. He had spent so long carrying the pain of their words, the weight of their cruelty. He had every right to turn away, to let them feel the burden of their guilt, but he knew that doing so would make him no different from them. Instead he simply nodded. I forgive you, he said, his voice steady. Nana let out a small sob and pulled him into a gentle embrace. It was the first time she had ever held him in such a way, the first time she had offered him warmth that was not out of obligation but out of true gratitude. Kwasi placed a firm hand on Kwame's shoulder, a silent promise that things would be different from now on. The children looked at him not with mockery but with admiration. As the night stretched on, they sat together around the fire eating the food Kwame had gathered. For the first time he was not eating alone in the shadows, but among them as part of the family. The storm had taken much from them. It had destroyed their fence, soaked their food, and shaken their sense of security, but in its wake it had given them something far greater. It had opened their eyes. And from that night on, Kwame was no longer just a servant in their house, he was something much more. He was family.